Okay, look, thanks very much. And I hope these two concepts will be of interest to you. And it's a great opportunity to share with the GIER community. Now, these two concepts are those which I found helpful in understanding how people learn and develop across the lifespan, albeit the research I'll be referring to occurred and focused on individuals' work-life histories. But the key focus here is that these two concepts, I think, are helpful in understanding both individuals' learning and their development. And this arose from the ARC Discovery Grant, in which we did life histories for 66 working age Australians, and then we did a survey of close to 400 working age Australians. And from these two concepts came out. The first one is this concept of the personal curriculum, which is about the pathways that individuals take across their lives and the degree by which they have experiences which are afforded through education institutions, their workplaces, but also their communities, and how individuals come to selectively engage with those experiences and learn from them. And the point here is that this concept of curriculum captures the totality of the activities and interactions that individuals have across the life course. And this, in some sense, shifts a consideration of curriculum away from what Searle referred to as institutional facts, those that are premised on and engaged by society, to focus on a concept of curriculum which has its emphasis within individuals' learning and development, which in contrast to an institutional fact is a personal fact, what is related to individuals' life history and how they've come to learn. That's been published already, that paper last year. The second concept then really is derived from a Deweyian concept about viewing educational experiences more broadly. And so to look at the kind of broad range of experiences from which we learn, which are not restricted to those which are provided through educational institutions, and to understand the sources of these experiences and their legacies. And that's also been published last year. So let's start somewhere. So the case then is that, as you all know, the original meaning of the word curriculum is a path to follow or a course to progress along. And this concept, though, perhaps in the era of schooling, has become viewed as being an institutional fact, that is, relating to institutional imperatives, in particular, what governments, religious institutions, and professional bodies want to achieve. And Tyler, who wrote perhaps the most hallmark book in curriculum theorizing in 1949, defined curriculum as achieving the goals of the school. However, I think that is, I'll just progress and I'll just come back and discuss this. Bobbitt, who is perhaps viewed as being the founder of curriculum science, earlier defined curriculum somewhat differently, as the entire range of experiences, both directed and undirected, concerned with the unfolding abilities of the individuals. That was 1918. At a similar time, Dewey referred to unconscious education, the whole set of experiences that people have in their lives. Much later, in 1975, Pinner referred to running, the set of experiences. Now, I just want to discuss these very quickly because Tyler's work, and I think Tyler never intended the impact that his book had in terms of the way that this idea of viewing curriculum only in terms of educational institutions and driving the agendas of government, religious institutions and professional bodies. He, in fact, I think stated that he had an interest in schools, but that wasn't necessarily the entire scope of his understandings about what curriculum might constitute. And I think it's interesting that that now has been taken on. So whereas Bobbitt is seen as being the founder of curriculum science, Tyler really is the founder of curriculum evaluation. And it's interesting the way that most of the curriculum models, which we now deal with, emanate pre-Tylerian. They came from Tyler and his students, such as Hilda Tabor. So this is all fine, except that it doesn't help us understand and focus on individuals' learning and development. One way of doing that has been to consider the experience curriculum, how students or learners help make sense of the experiences they have. So beyond the intended and the enacted is the experienced. And this then is a personal fact, the construction that individuals make of it. Yet when we consider this, the experience curriculum is inevitably considered about what people experience through experiences afforded through educational institutions, what is learnt through those experiences. And this tends to exclude all of the learning and development that occurs outside of them. Now, I'm interested in adults' development across their lives, and the vast majority of adults don't engage habitually in education institutions beyond the early years. So these definitions aren't particularly helpful in understanding that development. So we need a concept of curriculum that accommodates, illuminates, and elaborates the pathways of learning and development across the lifespan, and also to identify the kind of educative experiences which support and guide those pathways. Now, before I move on, I think it would be really interesting to actually look at the personal curriculum of Ralph Tyler, and look at the personal curriculum of John Dewey, and also Franklin Bobbitt, because these individuals had very rich personal histories, very rich experiences, which shaped their approaches to how they viewed curriculum and their approaches to education. Tyler, for instance, grew up in a dirt poor community in which he had to hunt for his food, wear second-hand clothes, etc., etc. And he made his way through a very demanding life to very senior positions within the US educational system. So I could apply this concept to the lives of these great theorists. So what's personal curriculums then? This is how I've tried to define it. It's the personal pathways of activities and interactions across the lifespan as shaped interdependently by what is afforded by the social world, mediated by maturation, how we change across our life, of course, and engage with intentionally, our intentional efforts to engage with what we experience, but also those unintentional engagements we have that arise from habitual and societally sanctioned activities, such as, we walk on the left-hand side of the road, we swim in the left-hand lanes of the swimming pool, we drive on the left-hand side, go to another country and it all happens on the right-hand side. So this definition seeks to then refer to the interdependence between the person developing across their ontogeny, their life history, how they come to engage with the social world, but also how that is mediated by the brute fact of maturation for young children and young adolescents as they develop, and also for adults as their capacities and abilities change, but their experiences enriched across their life histories. So I think it's these things that come together which capture this concept of the personal curriculum. And this obviously is far more contingent, far more complex than a definition of curriculum as achieving the goals of the school. Now, this is shaped by particular educative experiences that occur in schools, workplaces, and community, and how individuals elect to engage with them. And the concepts I use a lot to help me understand this are the duality between affordances on the one hand, that is the invitational qualities that come from the suggestions from the social world, from schools, education, government, parents, etc., familiars, on the one hand, and on the other hand, how people come to engage in intentionally or rebutting or rejecting the suggestion of the social world, and then also the importance of maturation, which Searle again pointed out the difference between institutional facts and brute facts. And what Searle said is that we can't wish either of these away. So in terms of the mediational means, how all of this developed, what came from our study was that we looked at key transitions across these adult lifespans. And what we found was that there were these three interrelated elements of the person, education, and community. And what's stated here is that the person, it was their capacities, their interests that mediated how they engaged with the world, including brute fact of maturation. Education, this was about the quality and outcomes of educative experiences provided by hybrid institutions, education institutions, or in their practice in working life. And then importantly, and perhaps unsurprisingly, was the impact of community and what is afforded by familiars, acquaintances, and social networks. So this suggests then that individuals' lifelong learning efforts, but also the provision of lifelong education provisions, are actually insufficient to explain that development, and that many opportunities such as apparently happen chance events arose from affordances that were provided and found within the community. Now, I've put inverted commas around community because it's a concept which is broad. It's about networking. It's differentiated across different circumstances. And if I had more time, I could give you some examples of that. But let's take one example, and this is of one individual, a guy called Alex. It's obviously not his real name. And you'll see in the left-hand column here that he had a series of transitions across his working life. In the column to the right is the kind of experiences that he had. And then there was a reference here to the kind of changes that he had to encounter across that journey. And in the right-hand column is the mediating factors that permitted him to engage and progress through those transitions. So this is a way we've tried to capture how the personal curriculum is enacted. Now, the second point, and I must press on, is this concept of educative experiences, which really draws upon Dewey. And Dewey said that the education process has no end beyond itself. It's its own end. It is a process of living. And so drawing upon the idea here is that we look at a range of experiences that are actually educative and helpful for these individuals and what they comprise. Now, what we found was that there were fivefold. And the first one was guiding towards and providing opportunities that would have otherwise been unavailable, and supporting and engagements in activities and interactions that would have otherwise been unavailable. Support and mediating of access to knowledge and engagement in those activities, which would have not been learnt through discovery efforts alone. That is, it required somebody else to mediate that. And then guidance in the development of those capacities, either through interventions, and then finally the acknowledgement, capturing, rewarding, and certification of what has been learnt. And this is an example here in this table of how we've captured these educative experiences. In the left-hand column, you'll see that there is these 5 categories of educative experiences. The column to its right indicates the frequency that we found in a total of 376 transitions across these 66 informants. And so we've ranked this table in terms of those educative experiences that were reported most frequently. And in the right-hand broad column, you'll see there is examples of those educative experiences and how they played out for those individuals. I could give examples, but I guess the time is short. But let's take, I mean, one of the really interesting examples was a guy who in February 2020, he was the king of the skies. He was a captain of a 777 flying intercontinentally. 2 weeks later, he was unemployed and he returned to Australia, and he was concerned about never ever flying again. And this is a very blokey bloke, king of the sky. And because of COVID, he had to return home, and he was worried. He was 55. And when you become 60 as a captain of a plane, you're not allowed to fly without being accompanied by a far younger pilot. And then when you become 65, you can't fly intercontinentally. So he was faced with some crises in terms of his continuing career, not knowing what the outcomes would be. So one of the things he did was that he'd actually already undertaken a certificate in aviation law, and he then enrolled in a Bachelor of Law at a Brisbane University. But he was actually a member of the local golf club, and in the local golf club were obviously Queen's counsellors, then now they're called King's counsellors, but also solicitors and lawyers, etc. And through their contact with those members of his community, his network, they provided him advice, and even one of them provided him with work. And these were experiences of guidance and support that he would not otherwise have been able to access. And so somebody who wasn't in the golf club, for instance, wouldn't have had those kind of experiences. And these were all very instrumental in not only his development, but also his decisions about whether he would pursue a career in law or try and get back into aviation. So what we found in terms of the sources of these educative experiences is that as follows, that of the 5 of them, 3 were most prominently found in workplaces, and that within the community, opportunities to engage, to transit and advice were reported. The example I've just given, I think, is an example of that. And then education was most frequent in acknowledging, capturing and certifying what had been learnt. Now, I'm sure if this was a younger cohort of people, this would be quite different, because the workplace would not necessarily be such a strong community. The point here is that the sources of this learning, the sources of these educative experiences were distributed across workplaces, community and education institutions. So this suggests then that a broader concept of educational experiences needs to be considered. So, for instance, when we talk about lifelong education, we need to think more broadly, including workplace experiences, but also, importantly, the contributions from community. So and to finish, then, so I think the personal curriculum and a broader consideration of educative experiences seems to be important for the following reasons. Firstly, it's knowing that individuals' development pathway informs how communities, workplaces and governments can afford guidance and support and interventions. We know, for instance, that even young school children who are making that difficult decision about post-school pathways crave local advice and try and find that advice to understand what pathways they should take. And the existing conceptions of curriculum cannot capture or inform lifespan development, including, importantly, from my perspective, adults' transitions across working lives. And I think this shifts a focus from privileging educational provisions to emphasising individuals' engagement with those provisions and communities across working lives. And then finally, placing individuals' pathways across as being centre stage. And this is perhaps not accommodated within mainstream educational discourse, I would propose. Acknowledgements are important. Thanks for the ARC for the money, but also thank you for the contributions of Leah Lee, Sarojini, Ray Smith, Debbie, and my colleagues from Geneva and Roskilde. And this study has recently been published in a edited monograph through Springer. So I'll finish there, and hopefully there's time for some questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stephen, and again, perfect timing, brilliant. You've done this before, obviously. Thank you so much. Wow, what a very interesting, couple of presentations. In the chat, there's at least a couple of us have been making this connection between the two talks about community. So really interesting work. First of all, any questions or comments from the crowd in the audience?
Can't be that bad.
Stephen, I was just wondering, in your so what bit, that last point about putting that lifespan center stage is not yet addressed in educational institutions. I'm wondering, is it because it's so specific to individuals and that's why it's kind of difficult to do? Like, have you found reasons why that is missing?
Yeah, I mean, and I think it goes back to what arose from Tyler. I mean, it's not just Tyler really, but I mean, if we look across, the history of education provisions, it's been addressing the needs of elite communities. First of all, it was the aristocracy, then it was the theocracy, and in times of the contemporary era bureaucracy in terms of shaping educational provisions. And if you look at education provisions across different countries, and you find quite different formats, but there is this delineation of education for children, blah, blah, blah. Yet we know, for instance, that people develop in different ways and have very different kind of experiences. So, for instance, if I'd grown up in Germany, there is no way in the world I would be a professor of education. I failed my 11 plus, which meant I didn't go to grammar school. I went to secondary modern school in Britain. And that would have put me then on a very different pathway than what I've been able to achieve through my vocational education, but also having an education in Australia. So these silos we create, which are helpful in some ways, can also shape pathways. For instance, in Japan, if you want to get into higher education, you have to go through the 2-year process leading up to it and take the national exam on a particular day. Hence, go to a Japanese university and you'll find all the students are 18-year-olds and 19-year-olds. You don't see adults in there because there's no pathways. So these societal measures are important in shaping not only the provision of education, but also shaping the opportunities for people who move through life and develop capacities at different points in time, and develop capacities which are not necessarily those that are generative of what happens in schools. I mean, I can honestly say I hated school. I found that a horrible experience, and I was just so happy to leave it. Perhaps that's one reason why I won't be a school researcher, I suspect. But again, shaping everything in terms of the curricula being associated with schools, it limits the discussion of it. It particularly limits the discussion when you consider if we consider the life course of people, the vast majority of the focus on education is in the first few years of that. And yet we have the need now for adults to continue to learn and be educated across lengthening working lives, given all the things that we have to deal with. And yet the focus is very much on a schooled model. And this arises very much through this era that we live in, which is the era of school societies, where schooling is compulsory, ubiquitous, and things flow from it. And increasingly, those measures are, the organisation of it is top down. I mean, in vocational education for years, we've had highly prescriptive top-down measures of what constitutes the programs, and increasing in higher education is now dictated by the requirements of professional bodies, etc., etc. So it is the legacy in some sense of the post-Tylerian view of curriculum as generating the achieving societal goals. It's interesting, you find very few instances of where educational movements arise from the community. Obviously, in childhood education, you have Montessori, etc., etc. But there is a tradition in adult education that comes from the community, and yet even those often get taken over and appropriated. So I think, sorry, very long answer to your question, Natalie, but I think the important thing is to realise and not take for granted the way that these social institutions and the organisation of education experiences and the conception of what education is about can influence heavily the pathways that people have across their life and the opportunities for learning and development accordingly.
Thanks, Stephen.
Wonderful response, Stephen. Thank you. Very interesting. Any other questions or comments from the group?
I was just going to make the comment, if that's all right, and I was just like to say thank you for that, for including the curriculum theorists and sort of the history of curriculum, because I a light bulb went off in my head, and I thought, oh, I'm going to tell some HDR students to come back and look at this recording. But to think about the relationship between going back over the work of people like Tyler, and I noticed that, Jen, you put Michael Apple, and some other suggestions have been popping up in the chat, but just to say that people who've already thought about, well, how did we get to this point with education systems, and how what's valued is constructed in a sequences of learning, is really it's quite fundamental to understanding a research problem, isn't it? So I just wanted to say thank you for that. That was wonderful.
Thanks, Sue.
Yes, Sue, I had a similar thought. That was a lovely slide with all of that, the curriculum theorists there that many of us know working in that space. Very interesting. Stephen, I've got a bit more of a theoretical question around, you talked about the unconscious aspect of the personal curriculum. So I'm kind of interested to know whether you've thought about this yourself or read anything in this area about the relationship between agency and a theorization of personal agency and this notion of the personal curriculum, if some of it's unconscious. Is there anything that you've come across in that area, or perhaps, have been thinking about yourself?
Yeah, I mean, it's a lot of it comes from individual subjectivity, and it is shaped by the way that, we develop and grow. I mean, Ron Hare referred to, the person being socially shaped. I mean, my view is there's nothing more individual than the social. Or social, the individual is social, and things are developed through the particular pathways of life that we have. So I don't like the idea of separating the individual and the social, because to me they are inherently interlinked. So when we go through life, we have particular experiences which shape how we think. It's to do with language, accent, for instance, how people speak. It's also the kind of ways that we're brought up to view gendered roles, for instance. Now, I spent some time as a young man living in Israel in the kibbutzim, and there is no expectation that a woman would cook, because everybody eats in the central kitchen, and there's no expectation that a woman wouldn't be able to drive a tractor, for instance. And so you have a different set of social circumstances which lead to very different expectations. And I think it's this, and I avoid the word socialization because it implies that the social suggestion is taken uncritically by the individual. But obviously things, and it's very important, by the way, I mean, we do not want people driving through a red light, and stopping on a green. These rules are important. But this is part of what we appropriate, and it becomes part of our sense of self. It becomes part of our personal epistemologies, that we view things in particular ways. And you as a tourist, for instance, you often see the inappropriate behaviours that occur when people come from a different culture to another culture, and the way they behave, etc., etc. So I think we can use a term like unconscious, but I think it's more that these are things that we don't need to actively think about, because we've developed a capacity which allows us to accept something as that, and then from time to time that needs to be questioned. And so, for instance, as we're now gender roles and responsibilities, issues of race and gender, etc., being reconfigured, that's often quite a challenge, because those have to be reconsidered.
Thank you. That's I like your point about the individual and the social not necessarily being separate from each other. That's very good.
No. I mean, Ron Hare said it better than I could say it, but it's the idea that there's nothing more social than the individual. We are who we are through the experiences that we've had. I can see Natalie on the screen here, and the kind of experiences that Natalie has had growing up in Singapore are very different the experiences, for instance, I've had or you've had, Jennifer. And these shape who we are. Yes, we modify and we re-engage with them as we go along. But these are fundamental to our views and how we engage them. Well, for instance, I come from the north of England, and in the north of England, we have a very, very dim view of people from the southern part of England. And we, have a particular view of resistance against the south. And that's part of the northern character of what I grew up in. And that's an element of who I am and how I engage with the world, for instance.
Wonderful. Stephen, thank you so much for that, and Carolyn as well. Big round of applause to both of our presenters. Another terrific lightning talk, and it's 12 o'clock, so we're going to end here. But stay tuned for the next one, everyone, and have a fabulous weekend.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.